The warning signs were there long before most Americans noticed. A farmer loses a harvest, a processing plant cuts production, a shipment never arrives, a grocery chain quietly limits supply. Individually, these events seem insignificant. Together, they reveal something far more alarming. Across the United States, a growing number of foods are entering a dangerous cycle: lower production. Higher costs, shrinking availability, and increasing dependence on fragile supply networks. What's unsettling is that many of these foods were once considered untouchable everyday staples Americans expected to be available forever. Now, experts are tracking disruptions that stretch from farmland and factories to supermarket shelves, and the public is only seeing the final stage of the problem. The real story begins much earlier, in places most consumers never look. Tonight, we'll follow the trail behind 9 foods quietly disappearing across America. And as the evidence unfolds, one question becomes impossible to ignore. If these foods are already disappearing now, what happens when the next crisis arrives? Item 1, coffee. For many Americans, coffee isn't a luxury, it's a ritual, a necessity, the fuel that starts the day. Every morning, millions of people walk into their kitchens expecting the same thing: a familiar aroma, a hot cup, and a routine that feels dependable, which is why the warning signs appearing in the coffee market have caught so much attention. Over the last few years, coffee prices have climbed sharply, forcing consumers to pay significantly more for something many once took for granted. At first glance, this looks like a simple story about inflation. A few higher prices, a few bad harvests, nothing unusual, but that's not the full story, because coffee reveals something much bigger. Unlike many foods grown domestically, coffee depends almost entirely on regions thousands of miles away from American grocery stores. A drought in Brazil, heavy flooding in Vietnam, plant diseases spreading through coffee farms, shipping bottlenecks at major ports. Any one of these events can ripple through the entire supply chain. And when several happen at once, the system becomes far less predictable. Imagine being a coffee farmer watching months of work disappear because weather conditions suddenly change. The harvest comes in smaller than expected. Expenses remain the same. Workers still need to be paid, equipment still needs maintenance, but there are fewer beans to sell. That pressure doesn't stay on the farm, it moves. Exporters pay more, roasters pay more, distributors pay more. Retailers pay more, eventually consumers pay more, but what most people don't realize is that higher prices are often the last warning sign to appear. The real signal is instability, because once a supply chain becomes unpredictable, shortages can emerge with very little notice. And what makes this even more concerning is that coffee is only the beginning, because another breakfast staple is facing a problem that started far from grocery stores and may take years to solve. Item 2, orange juice. For decades, orange juice felt untouchable. It was a permanent fixture of the American breakfast table. A carton in the refrigerator, a glass beside the morning newspaper, something so common that few people ever stopped to think about where it came from, until the warning signs began appearing. At first, it was easy to miss. A slightly higher price, fewer promotional discounts, smaller selections in the refrigerated aisle, nothing dramatic, nothing that seemed alarming. But beneath the surface, a much larger problem was unfolding, because orange juice doesn't begin in a factory, it begins in orchards. And those orchards have been facing a growing threat for years. A disease known as citrus greening has quietly spread through major growing regions, damaging trees and reducing fruit production. Unlike seasonal weather problems, this isn't something farmers can simply wait out. Once infected, many trees become less productive year after year. Some stop producing viable fruit altogether. And this is where things become concerning. Because replacing an orange tree isn't like replacing a machine. A new tree can take years before it produces fruit at full capacity, which means today's losses can continue affecting supplies long into the future. Imagine being a grower watching an orchard you've spent years building slowly decline. You invest in treatments. You monitor the trees. You absorb rising costs. Yet every season becomes more uncertain than the last. That uncertainty spreads through the entire system. Processors receive less fruit. Juice manufacturers face tighter supplies. Retailers compete for inventory, consumers encounter higher prices. But that's not the full story, because disease isn't the only challenge. Extreme weather events, shifting growing conditions, and rising production costs have added even more pressure to an already strained industry. And when multiple problems collide at the same time, recovery becomes far more difficult. The result isn't necessarily an immediate shortage, it's something slower, something quieter, a gradual decline in stability. And that's often how larger disruptions begin. But what makes this even more unsettling is that orange juice isn't the only beloved food facing agricultural pressure. Because the next item on this list depends on a crop that millions of Americans rarely think about until its price suddenly explodes. Item 3, chocolate. Few foods feel as permanent as chocolate. It's everywhere. Birthday parties, holiday celebrations, movie theaters, gas stations, checkout aisles. For most Americans, chocolate isn't something they ever worry about finding. It's simply there, always available, always familiar. Which is exactly why the warning signs emerging in the chocolate industry have surprised so many people. At first, consumers noticed something subtle. A favorite candy bar seemed smaller. A box of chocolates cost a little more. A family-size package wasn't quite the same size it used to be. Most people blamed inflation, and in part, they were right. But that explanation misses a much bigger story, because every chocolate product begins with one critical ingredient, cocoa. And cocoa production has been under increasing pressure. Much of the world's cocoa comes from a relatively small number of growing regions, particularly in West Africa. That concentration creates a hidden vulnerability. When weather patterns become unpredictable, when harvests fall short, or when crop diseases spread, the effects don't stay local. They ripple across the entire global market, and this is where things take a turn. Because chocolate companies can only absorb rising costs for so long. At first, manufacturers try to protect consumers from sticker shock. They reduce package sizes, change product formulations, offer fewer discounts, adjust product lines, but eventually reality catches up. Higher costs move through the system, and consumers begin paying the difference. Imagine being a cocoa farmer after months of difficult growing conditions. The harvest arrives, but yields are lower than expected. Income drops. Investment becomes harder. Future planting decisions become uncertain. Now multiply that challenge across thousands of farms. Suddenly, a problem that began in distant agricultural regions becomes a problem for manufacturers, retailers, and shoppers around the world. But what most people don't realize is that rising chocolate prices aren't the real warning sign. The real warning sign is dependency. Because when an entire industry depends heavily on a few key growing regions, even small disruptions can create outsized consequences. And this is only one piece of a much larger pattern, because the next food on our list isn't imported from tropical farms. It's produced right here in America. Yet it may be facing some of the most significant supply pressures of all, and for millions of families, the consequences are becoming impossible to ignore. Item 4, beef for generations. Beef has been one of the defining foods of the American diet. From backyard cookouts and fast food burgers to family dinners and holiday gatherings. It's deeply woven into everyday life, which is why many Americans assume it will always be abundant, always available, always affordable. But the warning signs appearing across the cattle industry suggest the situation may be more complicated than it seems. At first, the changes looked like ordinary price increases, a few extra dollars for steaks, higher costs for ground beef, more expensive restaurant meals, nothing unusual, at least not on the surface. But what most people don't realize is that cattle production operates on a very different timeline than most industries. If demand suddenly rises, ranchers can't simply produce more cattle next month. It doesn't work that way. Building a herd takes years, not weeks, not months. Years. And that's where the pressure begins. Over the past several years, many ranchers have faced a combination of challenges: persistent drought conditions, higher feed costs, rising fuel prices, labor shortages, and increasing operational expenses. For some, maintaining large herds became difficult. For others, it became financially impossible. As a result, cattle numbers in several regions declined, and once herds shrink, recovery is slow. Imagine being a rancher during a severe drought. Pastures produce less grass, water sources become less reliable, feed becomes more expensive, every decision carries risk. Do you spend more money to keep your herd, or reduce the herd to survive another season? Thousands of ranchers have faced exactly those choices, and when enough producers make similar decisions, the effects eventually reach consumers. This is where things take a turn. Because beef doesn't have to disappear from grocery stores to become a problem. Sometimes a food becomes scarce in a different way. It becomes harder to afford. Families buy less. Restaurants raise prices. Consumers switch to alternatives. Behavior changes. And that may be one of the clearest warning signs of all, because when affordability begins changing, consumption patterns often follow. But that's not the full story, because beef is only one example of a much larger issue affecting American agriculture. The next food on our list is found in millions of kitchens, restaurants, and packaged foods and its supply challenges began thousands of miles away in some of the world's oldest farming regions. Item 5, olive oil. For many Americans, olive oil is just another item on the grocery list, a bottle sitting quietly in the pantry, used for cooking, salad dressings, marinades, something so ordinary that few people ever think about where it comes from, until the price suddenly doubles. And that's exactly what has happened in recent years. Across grocery stores, consumers have been shocked to see olive oil become one of the fastest rising food items on the shelf. At first, it seemed temporary, a bad harvest, a short-term supply issue, a problem that would quickly correct itself. But the reality turned out to be far more complicated. Because unlike many crops, olive trees require very specific growing conditions, and much of the world's olive oil comes from a surprisingly small number of regions, particularly around the Mediterranean. Countries like Spain, Italy, and Greece have supplied global markets for generations. But when extreme heat, prolonged droughts, and unpredictable weather patterns began affecting harvests, production dropped significantly, and this is where things become concerning. Because olive trees are long-term investments, farmers cannot simply plant thousands of new trees and expect immediate results. A newly planted olive grove can take years before reaching meaningful production, which means today's harvest failures can create supply pressures that last far longer than most consumers expect. Imagine being a farmer watching temperatures climb higher than normal year after year. Rainfall becomes less reliable, water restrictions increase, the harvest shrinks, but expenses continue growing. The result is a difficult calculation. Produce less, spend more, earn less. And when enough growers face the same challenge, the effects spread throughout the entire market. Bottlers pay more, importers pay more, retailers pay more, consumers pay more. But what most people don't realize is that rising prices are only part of the story. The bigger issue is concentration. When a large share of global production depends on a limited geographic area, disruptions become amplified. A problem in one region suddenly becomes a problem everywhere. And that's what makes olive oil such an important warning sign, because it reveals how dependent modern food systems have become on a handful, and this is only one piece of a much larger pattern. Because the next food on our list powers everything from soft drinks and baked goods to breakfast cereals and candy bars, yet few people realize how vulnerable its supply chain can become when weather and global markets collide. Item 6, sugar is one of the most invisible ingredients in America, not because it's rare, but because it's everywhere. It's in soft drinks, breakfast cereals, cookies, candy, ice cream, sauces, even foods most people don't consider sweet. In fact, it's so deeply embedded in the food system that most consumers never think about where it comes from, until something disrupts the supply, and that's when the hidden importance of sugar suddenly becomes impossible to ignore. At first, the warning signs appeared as rising costs. Manufacturers began paying more for a key ingredient used in thousands of products. Food companies adjusted prices, retailers adjusted prices, and eventually consumers felt the impact. But that's not the full story, because sugar production depends heavily on weather. Too much rain can damage crops. Too little rain can reduce yields. Extreme heat can stress growing regions, and when major producing countries experience poor harvests, the consequences can spread far beyond their borders. This is where things take a turn, because sugar isn't simply a standalone product, it's a foundational ingredient. A disruption in sugar doesn't affect one aisle in the grocery store, it affects dozens. Imagine being a food manufacturer producing everything from cookies to breakfast bars. A key ingredient suddenly becomes more expensive and less predictable. Now every production decision becomes more complicated. Do you raise prices, reduce package sizes, reformulate products, absorb the costs, and reduce profits? There are no easy answers. And when thousands of companies face the same challenge, the effects begin spreading throughout the entire food system. But what most people don't realize is that supply chains often become vulnerable long before shortages appear. The first signs are usually subtle: price volatility, production uncertainty, market instability. Then, slowly, those pressures begin affecting availability. And that's what makes sugar such an important signal. Because when a foundational ingredient experiences disruption, the ripple effects extend far beyond the ingredient itself. A single problem can quietly spread across countless products that consumers buy every day. And this is only one piece of a much larger pattern. Because the next food on our list isn't grown in fields. It's pulled from oceans, rivers, and fisheries around the world. And the challenges threatening its future may be among the most difficult to solve. Item 7: seafood. For most Americans, seafood arrives neatly packaged. A fillet in the grocery store, a shrimp cocktail at a restaurant, a can of tuna in the pantry. What consumers rarely see is the enormous global system operating behind every piece of seafood they buy. And that's where the warning signs begin. Because seafood may be one of the most complex food supply chains in the world. Fish caught in one country can be processed in another, packaged in a third, then shipped thousands of miles before reaching American shelves. When everything works, the system feels invisible. But when disruptions occur, that complexity becomes a vulnerability. At first, the problems appeared isolated: lower catches in certain fisheries, unexpected weather events, rising fuel costs for fishing vessels, labor shortages at processing facilities, nothing that seemed large enough to affect the average consumer. But that's not the full story, because seafood depends on something many food systems don't: wild populations. And unlike a factory, fish populations cannot simply be increased on demand. If a fishery experiences stress, recovery can take years, sometimes even decades. Imagine being a commercial fisherman whose catch suddenly declines. The boat still requires fuel, the crew still needs wages, maintenance costs continue, but the harvest becomes less predictable. Now multiply that uncertainty across fleets, processors, distributors, and retailers. The pressure moves through the entire supply chain, and this is where things take a turn. Because seafood isn't just facing economic challenges. Many fisheries are also dealing with changing ocean conditions, shifting migration patterns, warmer waters, and environmental pressures that make future harvests increasingly difficult to predict. The result is a system becoming less stable over time, not necessarily collapsing, but becoming harder to forecast, harder to manage, and harder to rely on. For consumers, that often shows up as higher prices, reduced availability, or fewer options in stores and restaurants. But what most people don't realize is that unpredictability itself is a warning sign, because modern food systems depend on consistency, and once consistency begins disappearing, supply disruptions become far more likely. Yet seafood is only one example, because the next food on our list feeds billions of people worldwide. It's one of the most important crops on Earth. And the pressures surrounding it reveal just how interconnected America's food system has become with the rest of the world. Item 8: rice. For billions of people around the world, rice isn't just food. It's survival. One of the most important staple crops ever cultivated, a foundation of global nutrition. And while many Americans may not think about rice as often as bread, meat, or dairy, it's quietly present in countless meals, restaurants, processed foods, and household pantries, which is why the warning signs surrounding rice deserve far more attention than they're getting. At first, the disruptions seemed distant. export restrictions in foreign countries, poor harvests in certain regions, weather-related crop losses, events happening thousands of miles away. Easy to ignore. Easy to assume they wouldn't affect American consumers. But that's where things become interesting. Because modern food systems are deeply interconnected, a problem affecting one major producing region can quickly influence global supplies, prices, and availability, and rice is especially vulnerable to that reality, unlike many products. Global rice production is concentrated among a relatively small number of countries. When one experiences drought, flooding, extreme heat, or policy changes, the ripple effects can spread across international markets almost immediately. This is where things take a turn. Imagine being a food importer responsible for securing rice shipments months in advance. Suddenly, exports tighten, prices jump, supplies become less predictable. Now every purchasing decision carries more risk. The uncertainty doesn't stop there. Distributors feel it. Retailers feel it, consumers eventually feel it too. But what most people don't realize is that rice serves as a warning signal for something much larger. It demonstrates how quickly governments and markets can react when food security becomes a concern. When supplies tighten, countries often prioritize their own populations first. And while that may make sense domestically, it can create shockwaves throughout the global system. The result isn't always an immediate shortage. Sometimes it's something quieter. Volatility, uncertainty, instability, the very conditions that make food systems harder to manage. And that's why rice matters. Because it reveals how fragile global confidence can become when one of the world's most essential crops comes under pressure. But even rice isn't the most surprising example on this list. Because the next food appears in everything from pasta sauce and ketchup to pizza, soups, and countless processed foods. Most Americans see it every day. Yet few realize how vulnerable its supply can become when multiple pressures collide at the same time. Item 9 tomatoes seem impossible to imagine running short. They're everywhere. In pasta sauces, pizza, ketchup, soups, salsas, frozen meals, fast food, and thousands of packaged products lining grocery store shelves. In many ways, tomatoes have become one of the most important ingredients in the modern American food system, which is exactly why the warning signs surrounding tomato production are so revealing. At first, the changes appeared small: a higher price here, a lower harvest there, a news story about drought conditions in a farming region, nothing that seemed capable of affecting millions of consumers. But that's not the full story, because tomatoes are far more important than most people realize. Unlike specialty foods that affect only a handful of products, tomatoes sit at the center of an enormous processing network. When tomato production falls, the consequences spread far beyond the produce aisle, and this is where things take a turn. Imagine a season of extreme heat striking a major growing region. Fields produce less than expected, water becomes harder to secure, production costs increase. Farmers face difficult decisions about what to plant and how much risk they can absorb. The result isn't just fewer tomatoes, it's less raw material for processors, less supply for manufacturers, and greater competition for available inventory. The pressure moves through the entire chain, from farms to factories to grocery stores to consumers. But what makes tomatoes particularly important is what they reveal about modern agriculture. Many of America's most productive growing regions are remarkably efficient. That's the good news. The bad news is that efficiency often creates concentration. A large share of production can become dependent on a relatively small number of regions, and when those regions face drought, water restrictions, labor shortages, disease pressure, or extreme weather, the consequences become amplified. What most people don't realize is that food systems rarely fail because of one catastrophic event. They become vulnerable when multiple smaller pressures begin stacking on top of one another. A little less water, a little more heat, a little higher cost, a little less predictability. Individually, each challenge seems manageable. Together, they create something much more concerning: a system operating with less margin for error. And that's the pattern connecting every food we've examined tonight. Coffee, orange juice, chocolate, beef, olive oil, sugar, seafood, rice, tomatoes, different products. different supply chains, different industries. Yet all of them point toward the same uncomfortable reality. The system that feeds millions of Americans is becoming increasingly dependent on conditions it cannot fully control. And that's where the real story begins. Because what we've seen isn't a series of isolated problems, it's a pattern. One that raises a question few people are asking: how much pressure can the food system absorb before everyday consumers begin noticing even bigger changes? The warning signs are already visible. Most people just aren't looking in the right direction. And what happens next may depend on forces that are already in motion. If this were only about coffee, it wouldn't be a major concern. If it were only orange juice, the system could adapt. If it were only chocolate, beef, olive oil, seafood, rice, sugar, or tomatoes, most Americans would probably never notice. But that's not what we're seeing. What we've uncovered tonight isn't a collection of isolated food stories, it's a pattern appearing across multiple industries, multiple supply chains, multiple continents, and that's what makes it difficult to ignore, because each of these foods is being affected by a different combination of pressures: drought, flooding, disease, labor shortages, transportation bottlenecks, rising production costs, global instability, changing weather patterns. At first glance, these problems appear unrelated. But look closer, and a different picture begins to emerge. The modern food system was built for efficiency, not necessarily resilience. For decades, that efficiency helped keep store shelves full, products abundant, prices relatively stable. Consumers rarely had to think about where their food came from, or how far it traveled, or how many moving parts were required to get it there. The system simply worked. Until the pressure started building. And that's the part most people miss. Because major disruptions rarely begin with a dramatic collapse. They begin with smaller signals. Signals that seem insignificant when viewed individually. A poor harvest here. A shipping delay there. A disease outbreak in one region. A drought in another. Nothing alarming by itself. But when enough of those pressures begin stacking together, the entire system becomes less predictable, and unpredictability changes everything. Because once predictability disappears, planning becomes harder, costs become harder to control, supplies become harder to guarantee, and recovery becomes harder to achieve. This is where things take a turn. Because the question is no longer whether pressure exists. The evidence suggests it does. The real question is how much pressure the system can absorb before consumers begin feeling it in more visible ways. Will it mean higher prices, reduced availability, smaller selections, changing eating habits? No one knows for certain, and that's exactly what makes this moment so important. Because uncertainty itself may be the warning sign. For years, Americans have lived with the assumption that food abundance is permanent, that grocery stores will always be full, that favorite products will always be available, that supply chains will always recover. But history suggests systems don't remain unchanged forever. They evolve, they adapt, and sometimes they struggle. The signs we've examined tonight don't necessarily point to a crisis, but they do point to a shift happening quietly, gradually, almost invisibly, right beneath the surface of everyday life. And the people who recognize those changes first are often the people who understand what's coming next. The warning signs are already there. In grocery aisles, on farm fields, inside shipping networks, across food markets around the world, most people simply haven't connected the dots yet. Maybe these disruptions stabilize, maybe production rebounds, maybe supply chains adapt, or maybe these are the early signals of a much larger transformation already underway. The truth is, we won't know until it happens. But one thing is certain. The foods we've taken for granted for decades are telling a story, and that story is still unfolding. The only question now is what the next chapter looks like. And somewhere far from the grocery store, the next signal may already be appearing.